On a rainy Thursday, my son looked me in the eye and said, "You don't deserve a thing." No greeting, no hesitation, just a verdict, spoken in the middle of my own kitchen as if I were a stranger trespassing in a place I had built. The words hit harder than any gavel could, not the house, not a cent, not even his respect. I'd braced myself for the divorce papers, for the formal language and cold legal tone that reduce years of living to columns of numbers and lines on a page. But this was different. This was blood turning its back on me. My own child, the boy I had stayed awake for through fevers, homework deadlines, and heartbreaks, now standing like a witness for the other side. He didn't raise his voice. That made it worse. Quiet contempt doesn't burn, it freezes. I tried to find a reply, something to bridge the sudden canyon between us, but my mouth stayed closed. Anything I said would sound like begging, and I had already lost enough in this divorce. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee. The rain tapped against the window, and in the space between us, I felt the years we had shared collapse like an old bridge. He turned away first, his shoulders stiff, as if the conversation was over before I had even realized it had started. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, wondering when my son had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle to be removed. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please, write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? And don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It really helps us grow the channel. Now, let's continue. I didn't know it then, but that moment, the look in his eyes, the finality in his voice, would be the quiet spark that lit everything that came next. The letter, the courtroom, the truth neither of them expected to hear. And the day my son would realize that the person he thought deserved nothing had given everything. I didn't argue, I didn't shout. I let the words hang in the air between us, heavy and poisonous, until they settled into the corners of the room like smoke that wouldn't clear. My silence wasn't surrender. It was the only shield I had left, because if I opened my mouth, everything inside me would spill out in ways I couldn't take back. I knew how quickly a mother's pain could be twisted into proof against her. So I stood still, studying him. The lines on his forehead were sharper than they used to be. His jaw was set in a way that reminded me of his father when he was ready to win an argument, not to understand it. His eyes, those eyes I'd once seen light up at birthday candles and school trophies, were cold now, and they didn't land on me as a person. They landed on me as a problem. I searched for the boy I had raised, but all I could see was the man he'd become in rooms I was no longer invited into. I wondered when it had happened, when his loyalty had shifted, when my sacrifices had stopped being visible to him. Was it the years of whispered conversations behind doors I wasn't allowed to open? The way his father told stories in my absence, carefully rewriting the past in a way that always left me out? Or was it simpler, just the gradual erosion of love when distance becomes easier than truth? My silence wasn't just for him. It was for me. It was the only way to keep from breaking in front of someone who would see my tears as weakness. The rain outside deepened its rhythm, and I felt the sound in my chest, like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. There are moments in life when you understand that nothing you say will change the course someone has set for themselves. This was one of them. And yet beneath the quiet, I was memorizing every detail, the way he stood, the weight of his words, the finality in his tone. I was building a record, not on paper, but in my mind, for the day I would need to remind him, and the world, of who I truly was. My silence wasn't absence. It was preparation. And one day it would be the sharpest thing in the room. In his mind, I was the one who walked away, the one who turned her back on a marriage, on a family, on the life we had built brick by brick. That's the story he carried, the one whispered into his ear until it hardened into truth. I could see it in the way he looked at me, like I had chosen my own freedom over his stability, like I had traded love for selfishness. But the version he believed was only half a story, told from one side of the door. In mine, I hadn't left at all. I had been pushed out, piece by piece, long before the divorce papers ever touched the kitchen table. It started small. Rooms I was no longer welcome in, decisions made without my voice, dinners eaten with an empty chair where I used to sit. Every absence was explained away, smoothed over with polite excuses that made me feel foolish for noticing. Until one day I realized I was living in a house where my presence was optional, and my absence preferred. The truth wasn't in the shouted accusations or the quiet judgments, it was in the paper trail. In the letters I had saved, some written in my hand, some from lawyers, some from him. In the bank statements showing years of payments I had made alone. In the contracts I had signed to keep the family's business afloat while he was somewhere else, spending what I was earning. It was in the receipts for school supplies, hospital bills, mortgage installments, proof that I had been holding the foundation together while the walls were being pulled apart behind my back. But paper is cold. It doesn't tell the nights I sat in the dark, wondering if staying was helping or if it was simply giving him more time to erase me. It doesn't hold the weight of the silence at the dinner table, the way he would smile at our son across the room, but never at me. It doesn't capture the moment I realized that no matter how much I gave, the ledger in his mind would always show me in debt. I knew the truth lived in those letters, dates, and signatures, but they were more than just evidence. They were pieces of me. Proof that I had tried, that I had fought, that I had stayed until staying became another word for disappearing. And one day, those pages would speak for me in a way my voice never could. One day, they would be opened. And when they were, the story my son thought he knew would never sound the same again. "Keep it clean, no personal attacks, just facts," my attorney had said, her pen tapping softly against the legal pad as if the rhythm could make the process less brutal. But I knew something she didn't. Facts are never clean when they're carved out of your own skin. Every number, every date, every document she wanted to present had a story behind it. And every story was a wound I had learned to live with. She saw them as evidence, I saw them as memories. The receipt for the mortgage payment the year my husband disappeared for weeks, she called it financial contribution. I called it the winter I pawned my grandmother's necklace to keep the heat on. The letter he wrote, thanking me for covering the gaps in our budget, she called it proof of acknowledgement. I called it the month I worked double shifts while hiding my exhaustion from my son, so he wouldn't think our family was falling apart. The facts were cold on paper, but in my mind they were alive, breathing, carrying the smell of hospital antiseptic, the sound of slammed doors, the weight of nights when I lay awake wondering if love was supposed to feel like this. To present them without the emotion felt like stripping them of their truth. But my attorney was right. Emotion in a courtroom could be dismissed as weakness, as bitterness. And weakness was something my husband's side was counting on me to show. I had to learn the art of telling my story without telling it at all, to turn my life into a sequence of undeniable points that no one could twist or rewrite. Dates, signatures, payments, agreements, dry to anyone else. But to me, they were the bones of a life I had built and kept standing. I pressed each one into a folder knowing that someday soon, those cold facts would be my only voice. As I left her office that day, the folder felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper, but because of what it carried. Years of my life boiled down into exhibits and evidence. I understood then that the trial wouldn't just be about dividing assets. It would be about who got to own the truth, and I would not let him take that from me too. Late at night, when the house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. The folder of documents lay open beside me. Contracts, receipts, bank statements. But this page was different. This wasn't evidence for a lawyer to read. This was for the day my son might finally want to know who I really was, stripped of the shadows his father had painted over me. I stared at the paper for a long time before the pen moved. How do you fit years of sacrifice, betrayal, and silent endurance into sentences that can survive the cold light of a courtroom? I knew I couldn't just list what I'd done. Numbers wouldn't heal a wound like the one between us. I had to tell him the truth, but in a way that even if the judge read it aloud, it wouldn't sound like anger. It would sound like clarity. I began with the beginning, the life we had before the walls started to crack. I reminded him of moments he was too young to remember, how I carried him through fevers and sleepless nights, how I saved small coins in a jar to buy him the bicycle he wanted, how I quietly paid for his school trips when his father claimed we couldn't afford it. I didn't write these things to make him love me again. I wrote them because they were real, and reality was the only weapon I had left against the lies. Then I moved to the years he would remember. The lean years when I kept the house running on one income. The business loans I co-signed to keep his father's dreams alive. The repairs I handled when he was away. I wrote about the months I skipped meals so he wouldn't see empty plates. The way I mended clothes in secret so he wouldn't know we couldn't replace them. I didn't call it sacrifice. I called it love, because that's what it had always been, even when it went unnoticed. Every word I put down was a thread stitching my side of the story together, a story that had been frayed and pulled apart for too long. I imagined him reading it years from now, not in a courtroom, but maybe on a quiet night of his own, realizing that the woman he'd thought was selfish had, in truth, been holding the roof over his head. When I finally put down the pen, the page was full, but my heart was heavier. I folded the letter slowly, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with a single press of my fingers. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was my voice, my memory, my defense against a world that had decided it was easier to believe I deserved nothing. And I knew, without a doubt, that when that envelope was opened, it would change everything. When the hearing began, my ex-husband rose from his seat with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the story you're about to tell has already been rehearsed, retold, and polished until it gleams. He spoke like a man who had built everything alone, as though the years we shared had been little more than his backdrop, as though my hands had never touched the bricks in the walls we once lived within. His voice was smooth, practiced, each word landing with the precision of someone who understood the power of presentation. From my chair, I could see my son sitting directly behind him, his posture mirroring his father's, his eyes fixed on the judge as if he too had memorized every beat of this performance. And every time my ex-husband leaned into a sentence about how he alone had sustained the family, my son nodded, a small, almost imperceptible nod. But each one was a door shutting, the kind of door you know you will not be able to open again with words alone. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but with each nod, the air in the room felt thinner. I wasn't just watching my ex-husband claim my years of labor and sacrifice as his own. I was watching my child agree with him. And that was a wound no cross-examination could heal. I looked at the table in front of me, at the folders stacked neatly by my attorney's side. They were full of proof, documents that would strip the polish off his version of events, dates that would expose the gaps, receipts that would speak louder than his charm. But in that moment they felt like a fragile defense against the tide of influence that had already swept my son away from me. As my ex-husband spoke, he never once glanced in my direction. He wasn't here to acknowledge me. He was here to erase me, brick by brick, until the court saw only one builder, one provider, one parent worth crediting. And yet it wasn't his coldness that hurt most. It was the fact that my son was helping him do it without even realizing. The betrayal wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, steady, and all the more devastating for it. I sat still, my face calm, my hands folded on the table because I knew the moment I showed emotion, they would call it weakness. But inside I was memorizing every nod, every lie disguised as confidence, every detail of this performance. Because one day soon this room would hear the truth, not in the form of anger or accusation, but in the shape of evidence, ink, and the letter I had sealed with my own hands. And when that moment came, the sound of those closing doors might finally be replaced by the sound of one opening. The judge's hands moved methodically, flipping through contracts, bank records, photographs, each page sliding across the desk with a whisper that seemed to stretch the air in the room. Paper after paper passed beneath his gaze, the formal language of law stripping my life into cold lines of ink. I sat there, every muscle tight, watching years of sacrifice reduced to exhibits, my worth measured in columns and signatures. But the letter, my letter, remained untouched. It sat in the center of the table between my attorney's files, sealed in its envelope, its presence almost defiant. To anyone else, it was just another piece of paper. To me, it was the single thing in that room that wasn't sterile, wasn't stripped of its humanity. It was the only thing that carried my voice, my heart, my truth without being filtered through legal jargon or rephrased for strategy. And yet, it stayed there, unopened, waiting for the exact moment when it would matter most. I could feel the weight of it even from across the table, not in ounces, but in years. Years of holding this family together when no one else noticed. Years of choosing silence to protect my son from the fractures in our home. Years of watching my own story get rewritten in front of me, powerless to stop it. That envelope carried all of it, and until it was opened, the truth I carried would remain invisible to the people who needed to see it most. My ex-husband kept glancing toward the judge, confident in the rhythm of his own defense. He knew the documents they were reading now were technical, procedural, easy to spin in his favor. And my son, he still sat behind him, straight-backed and silent, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me once since this began. I wondered if he even knew what was in that envelope. If he understood that the letter wasn't just for the court, it was for him. That one day, when the noise of this trial faded, when his father's words no longer echoed so loudly in his mind, that letter might be the only thing left to bridge the distance between us. The judge paused, set the papers aside, and reached for another file. Not the letter, at least not yet. My attorney's hand brushed against mine under the table, a quiet reassurance that the moment would come. But the waiting was its own kind of torture. Every second that envelope stayed sealed was another second my side of the story stayed locked away. I sat there, keeping my face unreadable, but inside I felt like I was holding my breath at the bottom of a deep pool, waiting for the moment I could finally surface. And when I did, when that letter was finally read, I knew the air in this room would change. Not just for me, but for him, for my son, When my attorney stood, the tone in the room shifted. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a precision that cut through the air sharper than any outburst could. She began gently, almost conversationally, letting my ex-husband answer with the same confidence he'd worn since the start. But then she started pulling on the threads, dates, figures, small details that at first seemed harmless. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his perfect story began to fray. The first crack came with a date. He had just finished painting a picture of himself as the sole provider during a particular year when my lawyer slid a bank statement across the table. My name on every payment line, my signature at the bottom of each check. He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the document as if seeing it for the first time. The second crack came with a promise. He spoke about covering the mortgage without fail. Yet there it was in black and white, a month paid in full from my account while his sat untouched. Just a temporary arrangement, he tried to explain, but the way the judge raised his brow told me the words had landed with less conviction than he intended. From the corner of my eye, I saw my son shift in his seat. It wasn't much, just a subtle movement, the crossing of his arms, the slight drop of his gaze from the back of his father's head to the table in front of him. But to me, it was monumental. It meant the certainty he had walked in with was no longer unshakable. My attorney didn't let up. She asked about the business loans, the ones he'd claimed were entirely his doing. When she produced the signed agreements, my name appeared alongside his. The courtroom was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers, but the weight of those revelations was louder than any argument I could have made. Each mismatch between his testimony and the truth was another thread snapping, and with each one I could feel the balance of the room begin to tilt. My ex-husband's tone, once smooth, now carried the faint edge of someone trying to defend a story that was slipping away from him. I kept my face still, my hands clasped in my lap, but inside I felt something stir, not triumph, not yet, but the first fragile flicker of hope. The cracks were there. They were small, but they were real. And if there was one thing I knew about cracks, it was that they never stayed small for long once the truth started to push through. The letter was still sealed, waiting for its moment. But I could feel it now, the ground shifting beneath us, the story no longer entirely his to tell. And somewhere deep down, I hoped my son could feel it too. Halfway through the questioning, the judge leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood cutting through the low hum of the courtroom. He removed his glasses, set them carefully on the bench, and asked, almost casually, for the letter. Just 2 words, spoken without emphasis, but they seemed to ripple through the air like a sudden change in the weather. My pulse thundered so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The envelope I had guarded in my mind for weeks was no longer just sitting quietly among the stacks of paper. It was being called forward. My attorney reached for it with steady hands, sliding it across the table toward the clerk. To anyone watching, it looked like a simple transfer of evidence, but to me, it felt like handing over my heartbeat. That envelope was the distilled essence of everything I hadn't been allowed to say, every truth I had been forced to swallow, every moment I had kept silent because speaking would have been a losing game. Now, it was moving away from me, toward the only person in the room with the power to open it and give those words weight. Across the aisle, my ex's head tilted ever so slightly toward our son. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The glance was quick but unmistakable, a silent command. Don't react. Don't let this rattle you. But I saw it. I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, the way his fingers tightened on the edge of the table. For the first time since this hearing began, he wasn't entirely in control. My son kept his gaze forward, but I noticed the tension in his jaw. He didn't know what was in that letter. He didn't know that every line inside it had been chosen for both the court and for him, that it was written to stand in the sterile light of legal scrutiny, but also to pierce through the fog of half-truths that had settled over him for years. The judge turned the envelope over in his hands as if weighing it, and for a moment I thought he might set it aside. My breath caught. This letter wasn't just another document. It was the one piece of my case that couldn't be reduced to numbers or stripped of its humanity. If he left it sealed, my voice would stay locked inside, and the trial would remain a duel fought entirely on my ex-husband's terms. Then the sound came, a faint rip as the seal gave way. It was so small, yet it felt deafening to me. I sat perfectly still, but inside the air seemed to shift. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I had written for in the dark of my kitchen. My words were about to enter the room, unfiltered, undeniable. And as the judge unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the first lines, I thought of the night I wrote it, how the rain had tapped against the window like it was keeping time for me, how I had pressed the envelope closed with a kind of reverence. I had no idea then exactly how this moment would feel, but I knew one thing. Nothing in this room would be the same once the reading began. The judge's eyes moved over the page at first in silence, his expression unreadable. I could hear the faint crinkle of the paper as he adjusted it in his hands, the sound seeming to echo in the stillness of the room. My heart beat so loudly I was sure someone could hear it. I sat frozen, every muscle locked, watching the slow progress of his gaze down the letter I had poured myself into on that sleepless night. Then, without warning, he began to read aloud. His voice was measured, calm, but each sentence carried weight, as if he understood these weren't just lines on a page. They were years of my life distilled into words. The first passages were clinical in their truth. Contracts signed in my name when others had walked away. Agreements I had upheld in silence because someone had to. My signature appeared again and again, anchoring deals that had kept a roof over our heads, even when it meant pawning things I could never replace. The words moved deeper into the payments I had made. Not just the large ones the court would notice, but the small, steady ones that kept our son's life stable. The school tuition paid in full when I was told we couldn't afford it. The hospital bills covered without a word, so no one would have to know how close we came to losing everything. The groceries bought on weeks when I wasn't sure I could make it to the end of the month. Each fact landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples no one could ignore. Then came the sacrifices, the parts no contract could ever record. The nights I stayed up sewing torn clothes because buying new wasn't an option. The mornings I went without breakfast so my son wouldn't notice there was only enough for one. The times I took double shifts and told him I was just catching up at work, so he wouldn't see the desperation in my eyes. I'd never spoken these things aloud before. They had been mine alone to carry. Now they filled the courtroom, undeniable, stripped of embellishment, their power coming from the fact that they were true. As the judge read, the space seemed to change. My ex-husband's confident mask began to crack, not in any dramatic collapse, but in subtle shifts. The tightening of his mouth, the way his eyes dropped to the table as certain lines landed harder than others. And behind him, my son's posture shifted again, his gaze lifting, then lowering, as if weighing each revelation against the story he had been told his whole life. The letter was doing what I'd always hoped it would. It wasn't just defending me. It was making me visible again. Not as the villain in someone else's version of events, but as the woman who had been there every single time it mattered. And with every word the judge spoke, the silence I had held for so long transformed into something else entirely. Proof. By the time he reached the last line, my throat felt tight, not from holding back tears, but from the sudden lightness in my chest. The truth was no longer locked inside me. It was out in the open now, filling every corner of this room. And no matter what happened next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. None of them could ever pretend not to know my story again. When the judge's voice fell silent, and the last line of my letter lingered in the air, something shifted, not loud, not obvious, but deep, like the subtle tilt of the earth before a storm breaks. My son's gaze, which until now had been fixed unwaveringly on the back of his father's head, began to move. Slowly, hesitantly, his eyes turned toward me, and when they met mine, it wasn't the cautious glance of a child trained to look away. It was a searching look, as if he were seeing me for the first time in years. It was not the look of someone staring at an adversary, or at the stranger he had been taught to believe I'd become. It was the gaze of a young man suddenly confronted with the possibility that the foundation of the story he had been standing on might be cracked. For a moment his face was unreadable, but in his eyes I saw questions blooming where certainty had lived before. I could feel the air in the room tighten around that moment. My ex-husband must have sensed it too, because his shoulders stiffened and he shifted in his seat, as though trying to block the line of sight between us. But it was too late. The connection had been made, and it was holding. My son wasn't looking past me anymore. He was looking into me, through the fog, past the years of silence, into the reality I had been carrying alone. I thought about all the times I'd wanted to reach him, to explain, to fight against the half-truths that had painted me into a corner. But I had known that chasing him with my version would only push him further away. Now I didn't have to speak. The words I had written, measured, deliberate, unflinching, had done the speaking for me. They had landed without the distortion of argument or the noise of anger, and they were still echoing between us. In that look, I saw the boy I used to know, the one who would run to me with his scraped knees and tangled hair, trusting that I could make it better. I saw the man he had become, standing at a crossroads between loyalty and truth, trying to reconcile them both. And for the first time in so long, I let him see my face without the mask I had worn for this courtroom. I let him see the exhaustion, the hurt, but also the unwavering steadiness that had kept me here, fighting quietly for what was right. The room felt smaller then, as though the walls had drawn in around us. The judge shuffled papers. My attorney took a note. Someone coughed softly in the back. But all of it faded into background noise. In that space between his eyes and mine, something was rebuilding. Not fully, not yet, but enough for me to feel it, the smallest crack in the wall that had been built between us. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply held his gaze, steady and unflinching, the same way I had held everything else in this fight. Because I knew that trust doesn't return in grand declarations. It returns in moments like this, when someone finally dares to look at you and sees what's been there all along. The judge's voice was calm, almost deliberate, as if he knew the weight of each word he was about to speak. He didn't rush. He glanced at the notes in front of him, then back at the two of us. his gaze moving between me and my ex-husband like he was measuring not just the facts, but the silences between them. When he began, his tone was steady, not cold, not warm, but carrying that unmistakable gravity that makes everyone in the room lean in without realizing it. He spoke of evidence, clear, documented, undeniable. He spoke of contributions that could not be ignored simply because they had been silent or unseen. He said the settlement would reflect all contributions, not just the ones told in one version of the story. The words landed with a finality that felt like the turning of a key in a long-locked door, and then simply without flourish, I would keep my share, because I had earned it. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. I sat there, hands still clasped in my lap, feeling the echo of those words ripple through me. It wasn't about the house, or the money, or the numbers in a ledger. It was about the recognition, the acknowledgement that my years had mattered, that my effort had counted, that I had not been erased after all. In a place where the truth is often stripped down to technicalities, my truth had been seen in full. I let my eyes close for just a second, not to hide tears, but to hold on to that moment, to let it sink into me before the noise of the world could touch it. Across the aisle, my ex-husband shifted in his seat, his face unreadable, but I caught the faint tightening of his jaw. This wasn't the ending he had written in his mind. Behind him, my son sat still, his gaze no longer locked forward. He was looking at me again, not with the same unwavering defense he had carried in, but with something softer, something uncertain, as if trying to understand how many pieces of the truth he had missed all this time. I didn't know yet what that would mean for us, but I knew this. The verdict had not just settled property, it had settled something far deeper. It had put my place in the story back where it belonged. The judge's words still rang in my ears as the gavel fell. It was a sound I had imagined countless times in sleepless nights, but I had never imagined it would feel like this. Not like triumph, not like revenge, but like a long, steady breath I had been holding for years finally released. The kind of breath you take when you realize you've been standing all along, even when no one saw it. The hallway outside the courtroom was quieter than I expected, the kind of quiet that feels heavy rather than peaceful. The echo of the gavel still lingered in my ears, but out here there was no authority, no judge, no official weight to keep people in their places. Just raw air, cold against my skin, and the unspoken tension that followed us out like a shadow. My ex didn't look at me as he passed. His stride was brisk, his shoulders squared, as if he could walk quickly enough to leave the whole proceeding behind him. Not a word, not a glance. He pushed through the glass doors at the end of the corridor and disappeared into the bright light outside. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like to watch him walk away for the last time. I thought it might bring relief, or maybe a rush of vindication, but in that moment it was neither. It was simply empty. The kind of ending that doesn't slam shut but closes with a slow final click. My son remained. He hadn't moved from where he stood when the verdict was read. He leaned slightly against the wall, his hands in his pockets, his gaze low. He didn't follow his father, but he didn't come toward me either. It was as if he were suspended in a space between two versions of reality, one he had been loyal to, and one he had just been forced to see. I could see it in his eyes when he finally lifted them, the weight of conflicting truths pressing against each other inside him. I knew better than to expect him to speak right away. Words take time when you've been certain about something for so long, and then watch it start to crumble. He looked at me not with defiance, but with hesitation, as though the shape of who I was had shifted for him in ways he wasn't ready to admit. People passed between us, lawyers, clerks, strangers, but neither of us moved. I thought about bridging the gap, stepping toward him, breaking the silence with something small and safe. But I didn't. I wanted the choice to come from him, not from me trying to pull him closer. I'd learned the hard way that you can't force someone to see you. They have to open their eyes themselves. His gaze dropped again, his shoulders lowering just slightly, like the weight he carried had shifted but not lifted. Then without a word he took a step toward me, just one, enough for me to know that the wall between us wasn't impenetrable anymore. And even though we didn't speak, even though the space between us still held years of hurt, I felt something loosen in my chest. The truth had been spoken in that courtroom, and while the verdict had been for me, the understanding, the slow, painful, necessary understanding, was his to claim. That was a journey he would have to take on his own. But at least now, for the first time in years, I could see that he'd started walking. That evening the house felt different, still quiet, but no longer the same suffocating quiet I'd grown used to. I had taken off my shoes, set my bag down, and let myself sink into the old armchair by the window. Outside, the sky was the color of faded steel, the last streaks of daylight caught in the branches like threads of light refusing to disappear. I didn't expect anything to happen. The day had been long enough. I thought it was over. Then my phone buzzed, just once. The sound was small, almost fragile, but it seemed to cut through the stillness like a chime in an empty room. I picked it up, and there it was, a single message on the screen. From him, my son. 4 words, nothing more. I didn't know, Mom. I'm sorry. I read them once, then again, as if the meaning might change if I let it sink deeper. My fingers hovered above the screen, but I didn't type anything back. Not yet. I wasn't ready to disturb the weight of what those words carried. Weeks of silence had hung between us like a wall too thick to hear through, and now in the space of one small message, there was a hole in it. Not a doorway, not yet, but a crack where light could seep in. The truth is, those 4 words held more than an apology. They held the acknowledgement I had stopped daring to hope for, that he had seen, finally seen, a piece of me without the filter of someone else's story, that he had allowed himself, even for a moment, to doubt the version of me he had been given all these years. I leaned back in the chair, still holding the phone, my thumb resting over the screen as it dimmed and went black. The reflection staring back at me in the dark glass looked tired, older than I remembered, but there was something else in my face too, something like release. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was simply the quiet relief of knowing that my voice, after being silenced for so long, had finally reached the one person it mattered to most. I didn't respond that night, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew we were both standing in a fragile place. Sometimes the first words after a long silence are like a newborn. They need to be held gently, given time to breathe before more is asked of them. I set the phone down on the armrest, closed my eyes, and let the weight of the day lift from me piece by piece. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's light flickered on, the world going about its business as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But in my world, in that small space between 2 people who had been standing on opposite shores, the first bridge had been laid, and for the first time in years I believed it might hold. Weeks later, when the noise of the trial had faded into the background of everyday life, I went to the courthouse to collect the final paperwork. The clerk slid a small stack of documents across the counter, official, stamped, bound in the formal language of law. On top of it all was the court's copy of my letter. It was no longer sealed, no longer waiting. It had been read, entered into the record, preserved in ink and paper. I held it in my hands and felt a weight that was different from the one I had carried before. This was not the heaviness of being unheard. It was the quiet gravity of being seen. I didn't keep it for legal reasons. I didn't need it to prove anything to a judge anymore. I kept it because it had done what I always hoped it would. It had spoken for me when I could no longer speak without my voice being twisted. It had carried my truth past walls built of suspicion and silence, past the filters of memory and loyalty, and placed it directly into the light. As I ran my fingers over the edges, I thought about the night I wrote it, the rain against the window, the ache in my hand from gripping the pen too tightly, the way my heart had pounded as I sealed the envelope, unsure if it would ever be opened. And I realized something. Truth doesn't always arrive with fanfare. It doesn't always roar into the room demanding to be heard. Sometimes it waits. It waits in the quiet, in the sealed corners of an envelope, holding its breath until the right hands open it. At home, I placed the letter in a drawer, not hidden away but not displayed either. Somewhere I could reach for it on the days I needed reminding of what I had endured and what I had reclaimed. Because that letter wasn't just evidence. It was the record of my fight, the map of how I had stood my ground when every voice around me told me to sit down. Every so often, I imagined my son years from now, finding his own copy in some file he'd forgotten about, reading it again, not as the young man still tangled in the aftermath, but as someone older, ready to see it with clear eyes. I wondered if, in that moment, he might finally understand all the silences I had chosen, all the battles I had fought without making a scene. Justice hadn't come to me in a triumphant shout. It had arrived in measured words, written in ink, read aloud in a quiet courtroom where truth had room to breathe. And as I closed the drawer that day, I knew it would stay with me, not as a reminder of the pain, but as proof that sometimes the strongest voice you'll ever have is the one that waits patiently until the moment it cannot be ignored.